Hi there and welcome back. You're with Terry, and today I've got a special treat in store for you. I'm going to be styling 4 different Sergeant Junipers, demonstrating various pruning techniques, creating both gin and shari, working with various carving tools, applying wire and styling the trees. If you find the following content helpful, then you can thank me by clicking the thanks button just below the video. So let's get stuck in. This is the first of the Sergeant Junipers. When studying the tree and determining which branches should remain and which should be kept, you can see these branches are very similar girth and they're very straight, and so that's something that I'll need to be looking at. When working on a rough piece of material like this, the first thing that you should be looking for is an interesting trunk line, and I think this is the line that I've found to be the most interesting. It already has some movement and there's a little bit of taper in it as well. Today's material has been kindly sponsored by Stone Lantern Bonsai. They are out in Joostenburg Vlaktes in the Western Cape of South Africa. Stephen LaRue, the owner of Stone Lantern Bonsai, has actually field grown this material for the last 20 years. He has now made some of this stock available to the public, so I would encourage you to get along to Stone Lantern Bonsai and purchase some of these trees. After cutting off that branch that I didn't want, I'm now going to strip the bark off using this gin tool, and this is going to make rapid or quick work of that. This work is being done in late autumn, and so the bark is much more firmly attached to the wood below, and otherwise at other times of the year it would be easier to remove this, but this is a good time to be doing the work that I need to do on these junipers at this time in autumn. This next tool is a root cutter in fact, but I'm going to be using it for a different purpose. I'm going to be using it to peel off some of the wood on the trunk line that I intend to wire. As the trunk is fairly thick, I'm looking at reducing the amount of wood on it, and this should make wiring a little bit easier, or should I say bending a little bit easier. You could alternatively use a trunk splitter, but a root cutter is a very versatile tool, very robust, and in fact I have many uses for them. So what I'm essentially doing is just grabbing some material, splitting it away and then peeling it up, and this also results in a fairly natural appearance. A ginning pliers is also very useful for peeling some of the wood fibers down and giving you a little bit more texture. It's important that you do this kind of work while the wood is still wet, because once dried, these shari or gin portions become very difficult to work with peeling. These little Kikawa gin tools are also very handy. It looks almost like a little dental tool, and it's great for kind of just initiating some of the fibers to pull. In preparation for wiring the tree, it's advisable to remove all of the growth that you don't think you're going to use, as this makes it a lot cleaner and easier to apply the wire. I've decided to shorten the length of the trunk, but rather than just cut off the tip that I don't want, I'm going to create a gin with that. Although annealed copper wire is the preferred material to use on wiring conifers, I'm going to be using aluminium wire, as this is generally what most people have to their disposal. Thick wire is going to be anchored in the ground, and what I like to do is to just cut a sharpened tip, and this makes it easier to stick it into the soil. Try to insert the wire immediately adjacent to the trunk with as little space between the trunk and the wire as possible. Now carefully coil the wire using sort of jerky movements as you go up along the trunk. I find that with this thicker wire, if you just coil it around the trunk, there tends to be spaces or gaps between the trunk and the wire. Introducing those jerky movements that I demonstrated means that the wire actually forms around the trunk. Now I'm going to try to introduce a few bends and also some twists in the trunk line. When making bends like this, it's advisable to use very controlled, slow but deliberate actions, otherwise it's easy to break or snap the trunk. Additionally, try to make your bends where there is wire supporting the trunk on the outside of that bend. If you have access to a branch bender, that can be a very useful tool to use in a case like this also. A branch bender is able to produce a very compact bend. After applying the thick wire to the trunk, the next step is to apply thinner wire on the branches. You should always work in that order, in other words, thick wire to thin wire. In that way, should you need to cross wires, it's better to cross a thinner wire over a thicker wire than the other way around. But of course, the real reason for using the thicker wire first is because you're going to use that, or you will need to use the thicker wire for wiring or shaping the more dominant elements, that being your main trunk lines or your structural branches first. The last area of the tree to be wired is going to be the apex, and that is what I'm now concluding on. In order to help the tree through the stress of this massive restyling, I'm going to be keeping as many of the runners as I have available and can keep, and so that has not been pruned off the tree. So that brings me to the end of the work that I wish to do on this particular juniper at this time, and now we'll leave it for a number of months to see its response and then possibly get through to it again at the end of the new growing season. Next up, we have number 2 of the Sergeant Junipers from Stone Lantern Bonsai. It's another tree field grown by Stephen. It's a fair amount bigger than the first tree that I styled, but it presents a number of challenges and also some exciting opportunities. First up, I'm going to get rid of these lower branches that I can't reuse in the design. Of course, as with all junipers, when you're cutting off branches like this, always leave a fair amount of the branch behind so that you can create some deadwood with it. To make it easier to remove the bark with the gin tool, I'm just cutting off all these little side branches. I'm also going to remove the bark from the stubs of the branches that I removed lower down on the tree. I'm also going to link some of these stubs together and create more deadwood between them. Sap flow in the tree has already been interrupted by these stubs that have now been created, and so by removing the bark between these stubs, you are not going to be endangering the tree or the sap flow at all. And of course, it's going to make for a more interesting trunk, as well as the live vein that will form on either side of it. Now I'm going to be using a carving bit, specifically a Nibbler Maxi R type bit. I love working with the Nibbler range of bits as they really do remove a lot of wood without burning. And you don't need powerful machines to run them, just a Dremel is perfectly fine. Installing them is very easy. You just remove the collet nut and the collet that comes with the Dremel, insert the collet which comes with the Nibbler, and then simply screw the Nibbler into place. Use your spanner from the Dremel just to give it a final little tighten. I like to start my Dremel off on a very slow speed setting, and then I ramp it up until I get to the speed that works well with the tool. Working with the grain of the wood is certainly going to be a lot easier, and the Nibbler will rapidly remove excess material. Unlike peeling the fibers as I demonstrated on the previous tree, this tool can of course go across the fibers. As a result, very generally speaking, it's much harder to produce a very natural effect using power tools than it is to use tools like the ginning pliers to peel fibers back, which does result in a more natural appearance. Using bits to carve with results in a more sculptural effect. This cut-off section of the trunk, which is now being converted into an edge, ends very abruptly. So in order to make it look a little bit more natural, I'm first going to split the end with my root cutter, and then I'm going to use the gin pliers to peel this fiber down. Next, I'm going to apply some aluminium wire in order to bend these branches. Always remember that if you want to bring a branch down, the first bend or coil of the wire needs to go over the top of the branch closest to the trunk. This is so that the bend of the wire supports the branch and it's less likely to snap. And that brings me to the end of the work needed for tree number 2. Tree number 3 is another great piece of material from Stone Lantern Bonsai. This material from them is really uncommon in South Africa. Here I have two very strong dominant elements, these low branches opposite one another, and also again very much the same girth. So first up, I'm just going to remove the material which I obviously am not going to be able to utilize in the design that I have in mind. I'm going to prepare the portions that I want to strip the bark off by cutting off the little shoots. Using a gin scraper, I can then remove the bark very rapidly. I'm then going to enlarge some of these future Deadwood sections by joining up some of the gins that I've created. Next, I'm going to use a nibbler to do some of the carving. It's obviously advisable to do the carving work before you apply wire and style a tree, because of course if your carving bits make contact with the wire, something is going to get damaged. To help speed up the wiring process, be sure to remove the growth that you don't want to keep before you apply the wire. Cut the thick wire that you're going to be styling the trunk with to a point, as this will make it easier to insert into the soil. Insert the wire into the soil as close to the trunk as possible, ensuring that there are minimal gaps or no gaps preferably. Use somewhat jerky movements when applying the wire to form the wire onto the trunk instead of just simply wrapping it with the wire. Although it's ideal to use a single strand of wire, when you're working with very thick strands of wire, it's somewhat difficult to get it applied. So you can use multiple strands, and those can be wired or placed parallel and directly adjacent to the initial piece of wire that you coiled. Take a lot of care when applying this wire to preserve the branches that are on the trunk. For the wire to be functional, it needs to make proper contact with the trunk, and the spacing of your coils needs to be regular. I'm going to use a branch bender in order to put some nice compact bends into the trunk line. The branch bender allows me to be in complete control of the bend, and the added leverage that the tool provides allows me to exert a lot less force. Gin pliers can also be useful for shaping wired branches, in that you are able to grip the wire and bend the wire, and of course the branch is going to follow. This makes it possible to put nice little compact curves into these branches. And that's another one of these Sergeant Junipers done. This is another Sergeant Juniper, the final tree of today's video. These branches were of course used to help thicken up the trunk in the field growing process, but they are not going to be very usable in the future design of the tree. Instead, I've chosen this trunk line, which has some movement and has some taper in it. So as before, the first step is to eliminate the branches that I'm not going to be using. This is the lower part of the trunk with the branches removed. You can use a gin pliers to crush the bark, and then you can use your fingers to strip the bark off. Although it does work a lot easier at other times of the year, it's still possible to do it now in autumn. To give a neater cut, you can use a branch cutter as well. Then I'm going to use a gin scraper to remove the rest of the bark and also to increase the size of the deadwood area. And of course next to that or adjacent to that will be your live veins. For me, deadwood is very much synonymous with junipers in bonsai. So it's very important at these early phases of development or styling as a bonsai tree from rough material to create the deadwood features, and this allows plenty of time or years for the live veins to swell adjacent to those dead spots. If you found that content helpful and you'd like to thank me for it, please do so now by clicking the thanks button just below the video. Well, that brings me to the end of today's video. I hope that you've picked up some tips and ideas of styling your own junipers. I would really like to thank Stephen LaRue of Stone Lantern Bonsai out in Joostenburg in the Western Cape of South Africa for sponsoring this fantastic material. If you live in South Africa and would like to get your hands on some of this material, please do make contact with them. Thanks very much for watching. I do hope that you've liked and subscribed to my channel. I do update my videos every 2 weeks on a Friday at 5 p.m. Thanks very much for watching all the way to the end, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, take care and goodbye.